in 2011, I went off to teach in Massachusetts for a week. And when I left for the Denver airport on a Saturday morning, I had 5 sheep in my barn: Motown, Yvonne, Jordan, Phoebe, and Samson. I returned the next Sunday. Is that all right?
Yes.
The same day, 12 students arrived at the ranch for a private workshop, along with Greg, his first ranch visit that summer. On Monday morning, when a student named Laura asked Greg how many sheep we had, he said, 3. No, I said. You're forgetting the lambs, Samson and Phoebe. There are 5 now. I just let them out of their pen to graze, Greg said, and I could tell you definitively, there are 3. My house sitters that summer, I'll call them Monroe and Daphne, a young couple of Gen Yers who had lived at the ranch for 6 months and who I had a hard time conversing with, but tried to think the best of anyway, had not mentioned 2 sheep were missing before they went off on a week-long hiatus of their own. Back to the land types from Georgia, Monroe and Daphne had built raised beds in the yard for the 6-week frost-free growing season, brewed their own beer in the mudroom, and filled my basement with compost worms. They'd also raised chicks that spring without asking me or telling me in my kitchen. That April, when I was teaching in California and hadn't been home to check on things in more than a month, I was scrolling through my Facebook feed and found the following status update from Monroe. I sure hope our Great Pyrenees puppy stops shitting and peeing all over the house before half the Southeast shows up next month to visit. I had to marvel at Monroe's efficiency at cramming so many alarming details into one update. I tried to imagine one more alarming. Cooking meth again in the clawfoot tub with ingredients purchased with forged checks from owner's bank account. I called Monroe and said it would have been courteous to ask me if they could get a Great Pyrenees puppy, or even tell me in advance that was their plan, since they had one dog already. Especially since I bought everything they asked me to, including an indoor compost starter kit, a miter saw, and a pillow top mattress. There was a pretty good chance, I insisted, if they had talked to me about the Great Pyrenees puppy, I would have said yes. During the entirety of our conversation, Monroe sounded like he always did, like somebody who had just come back from a 72-hour rave. But several months had gone by, and now we were all used to Sadie the puppy, and the aroma of chicken shit no longer filled the kitchen. When we all overlapped at the ranch, Monroe and Daphne tended the sheep and the chickens, and I took care of the horses and the dogs. Now somehow we were down 2 sheep. To my surprise, Monroe answered his cell phone. They were staying a few days at the house of a friend in town, so they could drink all they wanted at the bar without having to drive the 12 miles to the ranch. Monroe didn't know what happened to the sheep, he said, but he thought he might have seen mountain lion tracks. And the coyotes had been especially loud lately. And he'd heard there'd been a bear nosing around Red Mountain Ranch, 5 miles up Ivy Creek last week. When I asked why he hadn't thought to mention the missing sheep when I got home, and why he hadn't locked the sheep into their predator-proof pen at night, as we always had, He had no answer. Remembering that a few weeks before, Monroe had drunk an entire bottle of wine with dinner, I asked him whether he was having any trouble. No, no trouble, he said, but he was sad about the loss of the sheep. Those sheep were my friends, he said, but he seemed to have already forgotten which two of his friends were missing. So Greg and I and my student writer spent several hours that day combing the surrounding hills, calling for Samson and Phoebe. Something's not right about this, Greg said, though I was usually the conspiracy theorist in the family. He isn't surprised or worried enough that they're gone. On the phone, Monroe had said that he and Daphne would come out and help us look for Samson and Phoebe. But 2 more days went by, and they didn't show. On the 3rd day, my friend and farrier Dex Decker showed up to trim the horses. And when I asked him whether he thought sheep in distress would move uphill or downhill, Dex said, "I don't think you're asking the right question." So what's the right question? I said. Dex thought for a minute and then said, "Well, shit. I guess it's going to be me who throws those kids under the bus." After I heard Dex's version, it was time to call Sheriff Fred Hasselkuss. "Pam," he said when he picked up the phone, "I was wondering when I was going to hear from you. You missing a couple of sheep?" I said I was, and he said, "Well, you might want to check the freezer down at the Far Dog." The sheriff's version and Dex's version lined up remarkably well, given the way news travels in a small town. It seemed Monroe and 2 of his friends got wasted the last night I was in Provincetown, and in the throes of what Dex called a bad idea at the bottom of a bottle, decided to slaughter Phoebe, the yearling lamb. They killed her in the barnyard in front of all my other animals, including Phoebe's mother, Jordan, the other sheep and the chickens, the horses and the donkeys, and for all I knew, the dogs and Mr. Kitty, using one of my good cooking knives. One of Monroe's friends helped Phoebe up off her front feet, and Monroe leaned in to slit her throat. Phoebe struggled hard, causing Monroe to cut not only her throat, but also his friend's brachial artery. But the friend was too shit-faced to know he had a severed artery. So the drinking party loaded Phoebe's body into the truck and went into town to a restaurant called the Far Dog, where the other friend worked as a prep cook and therefore had a key. In their enthusiasm for whatever bacchanalian ritual they were enacting, they forgot to lock the other sheep away. And so little Samson, only a month old, must have been dragged away in the night by coyotes. One can only imagine the 3 a.m. scene at the restaurant. The part-time chef butchering Phoebe, wrapping her in white paper, and putting her in the freezer. Monroe chugging a beer, sauteing a little garlic for the tenderloin steaks. The 3rd guy slumped at a 4-top in a corner, quietly bleeding out. street, a well-meaning insomniac notices a light on in the far dock, calls the sheriff's office, and suddenly Fred Hasselkuss's pager goes off. If Fred had not shown up at the restaurant when he did, I heard from Deputy Billy Fairchild, the bleeder probably wouldn't have made it. As it was, he was taken all the way to the Front Range by ambulance, 5 hours, overpasses, and even then, the doctors weren't sure they'd be able to save his life. Meanwhile, one imagines Monroe and the prep cook sat around in the far dog, toasting the manly life. Eating Phoebe. I had gotten no sheep in the first place because the county tax laws had changed, so pleasure horses no longer counted as livestock when determining agricultural status. If I lost the ranch's agricultural status, which it has had since homesteading days, not only would I have to move because of the tax burden, I would be doing a disservice to the land itself and to anyone who owned it after me. Monroe and Daphne and I had talked at length about what kind of livestock I should purchase. We had decided on sheep because chickens only counted if you had them in the hundreds, and I'd heard too many stories about goats eating side view mirrors off cars. We could have raised a calf every summer, but that would mean sending it to slaughter at the end of the season. With sheep, we reasoned, we could shear them and sell the wool, and sell a yearling ram or ewe now and then to another Icelandic breeder. I understand those sheep were named, Sheriff Fred Hasselkuss said over the phone, and I confirmed that in fact they were. Shame, he said, but I wasn't sure if he meant the naming or the killing. What do I do now? I said sincerely. Why don't Billy and I go talk to Monroe? Fred said. We'll tell him if he and Daphne get all their stuff off your property by 5 tonight, with an officer standing by in the driveway to make sure they don't give you any trouble, you'll think twice before pressing criminal mischief charges. I had not yet thought of pressing criminal mischief charges. But our sheriff is a good man, compassionate and moral, and in a very small town where neighbors have to depend on one another through the long and frigid winter, he likes it when conflicts get resolved along the path of least resistance. I'll send Billy out there right now to take some pictures, he said. We want to keep all our ducks in a row. Once I knew the story, it was easy to find the slaughter site. My Wusthof cleaver over here, an empty bottle of black velvet over there, a blood-stained golf shirt, a Texas Ranger ball cap, an unopened can of Pabst Blue Ribbon caked in mud, an unspooled roll of toilet paper, and several small pools of dark, congealed blood. Deputy Sheriff Billy Fairchild asked if he could take the hat and shirt back to town with him, but not before he regaled my private students, most of them sophisticated ladies from urban centers, with tales of cabin fever, unrequited passions, restraining order violations, and dramatic winter rescues full of severed limbs and body parts frozen to large pieces of metal. Before he left, he took me aside and said, "We can all be thankful that kid didn't bleed out behind your barn, Pam, or you might be in for a whole mess of trouble you don't want." Later that afternoon, while I taught my class in the living room, Monroe and Daphne moved their things out of the bedroom, with Fred and Billy and the county's GMC in my driveway standing by. The day after Monroe and Daphne moved out, a friend of theirs with a Georgia area code called the house phone. "Monroe doesn't live here anymore," I said in the most neutral voice I could muster. The young man barked out a laugh like a dog. "Did he leave on good terms?" he said. "Or did he crash and burn like he always does?" "You'll have to take that up with him," I said, and hung up. What had Monroe done, I wondered, in front of or to this young man, to make him willing to say such a thing to a total stranger? And how had he hypnotized Daphne? Sweet, southern, docile, acquiescent Daphne. What was she doing with herself when the men started sharpening the knives? Did she try to talk Monroe out of killing Phoebe? Did she hide in the house with the stereo so loud she wouldn't have to hear her bleating? I knew I was still asking the wrong questions, but I wasn't yet sure what the right ones were. What came next was a crash course in sheep and chicken tending, which I failed rather spectacularly 2 days after Monroe and Daphne left. I still don't know how the chickens got out of the chicken run at the exact moment one of my students opened the kitchen door. But the dogs raced out of the house like competing contestants in a game show. And faster than you can say, "Drop that chicken," I had two mortally wounded birds, one in each set of handsome wolfhound mouths. Fenton breaking his bird's neck instantly, efficiently, but William, still a puppy, managing to spill the guts of the second bird without actually breaking her neck. After wrangling her out of William's mouth and getting the dogs locked back in the house, it was left to me to cut off the chicken's head. "You can do this, Pam," my student Laura said, impressively composed, as I raised the axe, and the chicken blinked at me sweetly. "But you have to do it now because she's suffering." "What if I don't get it right on the first try?" I said. It was dawning on me that this would be the very first time in 50 years I personally killed a living thing other than bugs. And even spiders I usually took outside. "Then you will hit her again and again until she dies," Laura said, calm as the surface of a pond in summer. And it took 3 tries to be sure. But then she was absolutely dead. Laura and I carried the bodies a mile into the forest and left them for the coyotes. I hated killing that chicken. I hated that it was my lack of vigilance that put the dogs and the chickens in the yard at the same time. I wasn't even done hating Monroe for getting drunk and slaughtering Phoebe and letting little Samson wander off to get torn limb from limb by coyotes. And now I had to take a break from hating Monroe so I could hate myself. You didn't have to get raging drunk, apparently, to screw up colossally in the animal husbandry department. I was 2 sheep and 2 chickens down in a week, and at the end of the day, I had no one to blame but myself. Meanwhile, at the Tommyknockers bar in town, Monroe was telling everyone he couldn't understand what I'd gotten so upset about, because I told him when we got the sheep, he could do anything he wanted with them. The only thing I'd said to Monroe that could possibly fall into that category was that he and Daphne could keep the money from the wool sales. I'd lived in Creed for nearly 20 years by then. I was well versed in small towns and the way people talk in them. I'd had eyebrows raised at me for being on Oprah, and I'd received hate mail for an article I wrote for Santa Fe magazine that I thought was a veritable love letter to Creed. But I also knew this. Monroe and Daphne would be gone, as most tourists are, before the snow fell. A few years would go by, and no one would remember even their actual names. I also understood I'd been given a wake-up call to give the ranch more attention. I was never going to be able to live my life without house sitters, but I would screen them more carefully in advance. I would make it my goal never to leave the ranch for more than a month without dropping in. If I ever doubted how things were going, I would cut short whatever trip I was on and come home to see for myself. I got better at caring for the chickens and the sheep. The owner of the far dog sent me his apologies, assured me the employee who butchered Phoebe had been fired, and invited me in for a meal. We had more lambs, 2 the next spring and 2 the next. I lost a ewe to pneumonia the winter after Monroe and Daphne's departure, and a 2-year-old ram who apparently got himself cast up. That's rancher talk for stuck. Against the barn wall and couldn't move. He must have twisted his guts sometime in the night trying, because when I found him in the morning, he was stiff as a board. Doc Howard said, by way of consolation, "You know, Pam, sheep are born looking around for a place to die." The year after we lost Phoebe and Samson, Jordan gave birth to a ram we named Junior, because he was the spitting image of Motown, his sire, black with white spots and a white face and tail, 2 white legs and 2 black ones. Rams tend to get more rammy with age, and at 6, Motown was getting to be more than I could handle. I knew the rams would clash when Junior came of age, so I told Motown to a breeder in New Mexico. Junior stayed sweet and sired beautiful babies until the day his 3rd set of lambs were born. The first thing he did was try to kill them. It's not unusual for a ram to try to kill a male lamb. Motown had knocked Junior sideways the day Junior was born, but once it became clear both lambs were females, I feared Junior might have a screw loose. We moved him out with the horses, where in spite of the size differential, he found ways to terrorize them too. Kicking his little hoof out, Van Morrison style, at sweet old Roni and running him off pile after pile of hay. My gelding, DeSeo, tried to stick up for Roni, cracking Junior in the head with a full extension kick of both back hooves on more than one occasion. It made a hell of a noise when his hooves hit those horns, but it seemed not even to faze Junior, as a ram's head is designed to be slammed into over and over again. Junior rammed me often, so hard it sent me sprawling in the sheep pen. So hard that when I got done with chores and went in to take a shower, I found the back of my leg severely abraded and the inside of my pants covered in blood. I built a whole new pen to isolate Junior further, but by that time he'd learned that if he applied continuous pressure to the metal stakes I'd sunk in the ground, he could uproot them. And when I sunk them deeper, he learned he could hook his horns into the wire fencing and eventually tear a hole in it big enough to ram through. You would think a 53-year-old woman could outsmart a 4-year-old ram, but I couldn't. By that time, the lambs were 9 months old, and I knew with their mother's help, they could all hold their own against them. I hoped putting Junior back in with the ewes would calm him down, and at first it did. But then Junior chose Natasha, a 2-year-old ewe, as the victim of his bullying. Spending so much time keeping her off her food, he barely got to eat himself. Each morning I let her out alone so she could eat her hay in the snowy yard. It didn't take 2 weeks for Junior to start bashing down doors again. The third morning in a row, I woke to Jordan and all the other girls standing belly deep in snow, 100 yards from the pen, just asking a coyote to come have a feast. I decided enough was enough. If I took no action, someone was going to get killed, and odds were it wouldn't be Junior. On a ranch, I have learned, it is often the sweetest residents who die. It was getting close to the start of spring quarter at UC Davis, and I couldn't leave a new house sitter with this problem. Couldn't take the risk Junior might ram her as hard as he rammed me. I put Junior up on Craigslist and tried to sell him, but at that time of year, no one needs another mouth to feed. My friend Sam Arnold asked her hunter son if he could make use of the meat and the cape, and he said he could. He came to the house on a brilliantly sunny afternoon and told me to lure Junior out of the pen. I went into the barn and got a can of grain, and Junior followed me out into the yard. Then the young man told me to step away, and I did. He raised his rifle to his eye from 30 yards away and shot Junior right between the eyes. For 4 seasons in my 20s, I worked as a doll sheep hunting guide in the Brooks and Alaska ranges. It was one hunter and one guide for 10 days. That's how long it took, because the rams were smart and they could climb much faster than we could. Their sense of smell was about 10,000 times better than ours. So if we were upwind, we had to stay put for hours. Their vision was unparalleled, and when they slept in groups in the afternoon, they always left a sentry keeping watch. Even when we were downwind, we had to find a way to approach the rams without crossing open terrain, which in the treeless high country of Alaska is nearly impossible. Even with 10 days at our disposal, the hunters only killed 35% of the time. I guided sheep hunters in Alaska because I was in love with a guy who made his living that way, and because I wanted, more than anything, to be out in the Alaskan bush for 2 months a year. I've never quite come to peace with myself for doing it, but those seasons taught me a lot about myself as a carnivore, about the relationship between meat eaters and game. Most of the hunters who killed on those hunts had great respect for the sheep and their environment, and the ones who didn't generally went home empty-handed. Killing Junior was the exact opposite of all that. And in spite of the close range and Sam's son's perfect marksmanship, he died hard, bellowing and spinning and spewing blood across the snow for 20 feet in all directions, while Sam and I and all the other animals looked on, amazed. In Alaska, we'd instructed the shooters to shoot the rams not in the skull plate, as this young man had, but through the heart. What had sickened me most when Monroe killed Phoebe was that he'd done it in front of the other animals. I'd imagined the horses, DeSeo especially, smelling the beer and blood and thinking they might be next. And now here I was, creating the same trauma a few years later, minus the booze, minus the blood, minus the knife, plus one head-rattling explosion. He was either a good bad man or a bad good man, reads one of my favorite Toni Morrison lines. It all depends on what you hold dear. By which I think she means longevity has a way of turning heroes into villains and vice versa. With Junior, life had delivered me an opportunity to stop holding a grudge against Monroe. It handed me a particular set of circumstances, and the next thing I knew, I had blood on my hands. There is something deeply wrong, my years as a hunting guide taught me, with anyone who can take a life lightly. For the most part, neither the hunters I guided nor the ranchers I know in this valley ever do. When I had to kill the chicken that William eviscerated, when I lured Junior out to the yard with a can of grain, I understood that Monroe had not been lying when he said the sheep were his friends. Sometimes friends do terrible things to each